Hello and welcome everyone. I'd like to do a quick audio check. Can you please use the Q&A box or the chat box to let me know that you can hear me okay? Great, thank you all very much. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Diversity and Inclusion Efforts, Don't Let Your College Fall Behind. A few housekeeping items to go over. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. We will be sending a recording of today's webinar to everyone that registered via the email that you registered with. Earlier this year, we announced our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council to join MCCA's standing councils of the associations to raise awareness of issues on race, inclusion, and belonging in higher education. Please connect with us using the hashtag MCCA webinar today. We love seeing those pictures on social media. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Keith Fuller at St. Louis Community College. It has been such a pleasure working with him on this webinar, and I am thrilled that he reached out to us about this. So, Keith, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kaylin. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Diversity and inclusion. How can community colleges keep the momentum going for their diversity and inclusion efforts? This time can be a great time for planning and sharing ideas regarding programming, which can allow colleges to return better prepared and with a menu of options to enhance their diversity and inclusion options. Again, my name is Keith Fuller, and I serve as the Director for Diversity and Inclusion for St. Louis Community College. And joining me today in this conversation are two individuals who you will see have a wealth of experience and comments to share. First, Deidre Denny. Deidre Denny has recently been named Transylvania University's new Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion. Previously, Ms. Denny served as the Chief Diversity Officer at Anne Arundel Community College in Maryland, and has worked in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field in higher education and private industry since 2003. As Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Transylvania University, Denny will serve as the Chief University Diversities Officer and as a member of the President's Cabinet. She will advise the President and Cabinet on matters of interest regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, and will oversee the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Denny's move to Transylvania is a return to Kentucky as she completed her bachelor's degree at the University of Louisville. She holds a master's degree in human resources development from Webster University, and she also has St. Louis connections. And she also holds a doctorate of public administration from Valdosta State. Vincent Fluellen is the Webster University connection. He joined Webster in October 2018 and serves as the Chief Diversity Officer. Reporting directly to the Chancellor, he provides key leadership for the university's core value of advancing diversity and inclusion as part of the educational mission through the university's network of domestic and international locations. With almost 2 decades of experience weaving diversity, inclusion, and equity into the culture of education in the St. Louis area, Fluellen's most recently served as the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the College School in Webster Groves. Before taking his role at the College School, he taught in the Ladue School District and for Mary Institute and St. Louis Country Day, also known as MICDS. He also served as the Center Director of the University City's Children's Center. Fluellen holds a Master's of Social Work from the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, and his BA in Education is from Maryville University. So Deidre and Vincent, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. We will have time for questions. And so various times we may check the chat, but we certainly will check it towards the end of this conversation. So much to talk about, so much going on, troubling times, even as we wake up this morning. It was back in early March when our students were about to go on spring break. And we thought, how best do we deal with COVID-19? What is happening? We hear of outbreaks all over the country, particularly in universities, colleges, dealing with COVID-19. Personally, I remember getting a call from my daughter who was going to school in Nashville. And she said, hey, Dad, I'm at the SEC championship basketball tournament, and they just made an announcement that no fans will be allowed after today. Well, less than 24 hours later, I got a call from her and she said, Dad, they just announced that the tournament is fully canceled. 2 days later, I got a call saying, we may have to move out of the dorms. And 1 day later, I drove down to Nashville and picked her up because no students were on the dorm. St. Louis Community College, we quickly pivoted and we established a COVID-19 response team under the leadership of Hart Nelson. We've been meeting every Tuesday since. So I'd like to first start this conversation dealing with COVID-19 and the responses to COVID-19 of our various institutions of the immediate nature. And then I also want to pivot off of that and look at how we took into consideration the effects that were happening to people of color and our employees of people in color. So first I want to go to you, Deidre. What was going through your mind back in mid-March as you were playing a part of your leadership's role in dealing with COVID-19?
So yeah, thanks, Keith. This is a very timely and interesting topic. So back in March, around the time that everyone else was finding about COVID, Anne Arundel Community College was as well. And we immediately, like you did, got a team together. How are we going to address what is happening? There was so much in flux. No one knew if this was just a temporary situation. Was this going to be long-term? It was really a lot of running around trying to figure out what's the best emergency management response we could have to this pandemic. And this is before they were really using the terminology pandemic, because there was still confusion as to whether or not this was some sort of flu or virus that was going to be short-lived, and all of the subsequent political footballs that went back and forth. And so very quickly, we were already going on spring break when the decision was made that we were shutting down. And so in one sense, it was not too big of a lift because we were shutting down for spring break anyway. People weren't going to be there. Students didn't have an expectation of class. But it soon became apparent in the second week that we needed to do something different because we were not reopening, and we needed faculty and staff all hands on deck to figure out what we were going to do in order to continue and complete the semester. The luxury of community colleges is that we are used to doing things online in a virtual environment for our students. So our faculty were really pretty prepared and quick to jump on Canvas and those kinds of things in order to continue teaching. But it was a matter of getting a hold of students, letting them know what was happening. So I have to admit that in the beginning, it was very upside down and inside out, if you will, in our response. You know, what do you do? Because one day you got information and the next day that information was contradicted. And then the third day, it was additional information that contradicted the 2 days prior. And I can't say necessarily that in these 6 months that we've been in this pandemic and having to pivot from what we know to be normal to now a new way of doing things, that it still doesn't feel herky-jerky in some sense. But I think early on when we decided, hey, this is an emergency management response, and we were able to execute along the lines of what would we do, and if this was any other kind of emergency, what are the calls that need to be made, who needs to be identified as leaders, how are we processing requests and information, who's going to speak for the institution. All of those things we used our emergency management task force to address. And while I can't say things were smooth as butter, it was more like the butter that was being churned, if you will, that we had some ups and some downs. But at the end of the day, community colleges were able, by and large, to pivot in a very proactive way during this period of time, at least the community colleges that I'm familiar with, because now I'm at a four-year university, and it was different because there are different audiences and different outcomes. So community college in Maryland that I was at, we didn't have residence life. And much like your daughter, one day it was this, the next day it was this, the next day is this. At the university, because we have dorms and because we have residence life, it was a different kind of pivot. And so I have to say, if I had to compare the two, the response from community colleges was a little more succinct and direct and proactive, because there were not a lot of loose pieces and loose ends that we had to tie up neatly in order to pivot online. Whereas in the four-year institution, online is not the rigor du jour, if you will, of how they conduct class or business.
Yeah, we normally take spring break for a week. We extended the spring break to 2 weeks to allow our faculty to make adjustments, to make sure everything was ready online, to make sure that our students had the capabilities to come back and be on a more online structure. And we have 4 campuses, but they're primarily all in the city of St. Louis County. Vincent, you are in a totally different situation. We were getting numbers around the world as to how COVID is affecting individuals, different strategies from country to country, and your institution is around the world. What was your initial reaction? What was your college's initial reaction?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Keith, for having me. Thank you, Kaylin and Bobby and the MCCA for this invitation and this opportunity to join you all this morning. Dr. Denny, it's a pleasure to finally see you as well. Like both of your institutions, we too immediately responded, and I joined I was appointed to our COVID task force as well. And we happened to actually be on spring break at that time, and immediately began to meet daily. Like you, Keith, we continue to meet weekly as a COVID task force, but at that time we met daily for probably, the better part of at least a good month or so. Taking into consideration not only our St. Louis home campus here, but also thinking about, as you said, we have 24 sites domestically across the country, as well as, about 8 or so globally. And so, the bulk and the vast majority of our students are here in St. Louis within our United States network. We are a residential campus here. Our other domestic sites are not residential. And so that became a huge part of our consideration as well. With our students being on spring break, there was a lot of conversations in terms of, because as Dr. Denny pointed out, we weren't sure what we really were dealing with, or to the degree at which we were dealing, right? And so the idea of, well, we can have students come back, we can have students, do this social distancing piece and continue on with class as best we can. Obviously, that shifted rather quickly, in part because of our local government, right? Our local governments began to, I think, in many ways, make the decisions that, sadly, I'm not so sure that our leadership was willing to make at that time, out of a variety of reasons: considerations for families, considerations for the fact that some of our students didn't have a place to return to that's safe, right? And so taking that into consideration. Taking into consideration the fact, the realities of it, right? Like, this is a business at the end of the day, right? And still needing to provide and produce a service for students and families that have made a financial commitment to receiving this quality education. And so all of that taken into consideration, our initial plan was that we would return, right? We would welcome our students back from their spring break. As I said, our local government decided otherwise for us. And so we began immediately phasing students as soon as they came back to campus to then return home. As we think about those families or those students for whom returning home was not really an option, we did host and continue to host throughout the summer about 70 students on campus, providing for them a safe space. Some students just, were not able to return for travel reasons, for a variety of reasons. We continued to meet over the summer. We have since formed out of that a working group, 3 working groups that began to really ultimately began to kind of look at how do we return. And so we have returned and we are back on campus. And we are, preparing to kind of, take that which we learned from March and mapping out, how we might, if necessary, do a similar return there.
Well, when you say when we started learning things in March and April, one of the things that we learned quickly was, or one of the messages that were coming out, is that young people were told that this was a virus that did not affect them. So we'll circle back to that, but I want to go to one of the more direct pieces of information that we both know was coming out, which was everyone can get COVID-19, but the death toll, those who are severely affected by COVID-19 were people of color. And we saw statistical information from Detroit to Baltimore to St. Louis saying that people of color were more disproportionately affected in ways from COVID-19. And so how did your schools take into consideration individuals who were, one, cleaning the facilities, because those individuals disproportionately are people of color? And so what type of steps or what type of conversations did you all have with regards to those? Deidre, I'll go to you first.
So yeah, there was a lot of information flying back and forth about who could get it and who couldn't. There was even information that I saw in social media saying that Black people couldn't get it. And I thought, what in the world is this madness that's out here? And so right away, getting PPE was at the forefront of the conversation, part of our response, making sure that our housekeeping facilities staff had gloves and masks and what have you, the gaiters, whatever it is that you could cover your mouth, because there was no way at this time, and now we're talking 2 weeks after a week and 2 weeks after spring break is over and we're coming back, trying to figure out what end is up. And getting N95 masks, forget it. You couldn't get them on Amazon. You couldn't, unless you found somebody that was street hustling, there was no way to get an N95 mask anywhere. And so, that was really a lot of the conversation. What masking, what PPE are we going to provide that will make our staff safe? And the science is still out there, because I just read, about a month ago, the gaiters are now not considered to be a safety masking situation. And so gloves, masks, did we need to buy hazmat suits? Those were the kind of conversations that went on. And I hate to say, as 6 months in, people are still asking the question about what is appropriate PPE in this day and age. I'm seeing a lot of what we did at Anne Arundel, because we're community college, the community was really part and parcel of who works there, who gets educated there. We are in the center of a subdivision, if you will. And so we're very concerned about everybody that was around, and, you know, how do we help not just the people that work here, but the people that were outside? Do we have supplies? And our health and sciences division, the College of Health and Sciences, they collected all of their PPE that they had for labs and sent it to the Anne Arundel Community Medical Center, because the medical center was like, we can't get the stuff either. And there was no federal depository being opened at that time. And so that's what we did. We sent a lot of stuff, whatever we could, over to the medical center, and then made sure that whatever we knew at the time to be true is what we provided for anyone that was going to work on campus. And because we shut campus down, people weren't allowed to go back to their offices for months. It was not just 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it was 2 months before you could even go back on campus and get your personal belongings. And then when you went back, what did you do? You had to come in a mask, you had to wear gloves, and we did a lockout tag out. If you went in your office, there was a tag on the door that said this room had been cleaned and disinfected. You had to turn the tag around on the back so that housekeeping, when they did their review of the campus, any tag that was backwards would be a room that they would then enter and disinfect again. So, I mean, it was a whole just cadre of things that we had to do, trying to protect the most vulnerable people on campus, which are our facilities people, because still today, can you wear a face shield and not transmit the COVID? Or do you have to wear the face shield and a mask and goggles and gloves and a hat and hazmat? The science is not keeping up with the mythology that is being created around this virus, unfortunately.
Vincent, what type of conversations did you all have regarding the effects of people of color and those individuals who were cleaning your facilities?
You know, Keith, you and I talked earlier this week, and at that time I gave some thought. I was like, what were those conversations? And then it dawned on me, we didn't really have the conversations related to our facilities and our food service folks, because we actually outsource those. Those services are provided to us through a third party entity. I do know many of them, and at that time when we were still present on campus, you know, there was a lot of concern for them just in terms of their hours and being cut back. I do recall their director, who we have two different groups. One does the food service and one does the facilities. And the food service team were the ones who I see more often, and they were the ones who were most concerned about their hours. And their campus supervisor here really was working to get other opportunities for them outside of Webster University to continue to his best ability, keep them whole. I have not seen them since I've been back on campus, as part of our plan is that food service is really only available for students. And so I have not had a chance to engage with them to see how well that went. My guess is it may not have gone as well, because many other places, and particularly universities, also then took the same path, right? And going on to lockdown. And my guess would be that, you know, if they had other opportunities, they were still that front line, you know, and so they were still most vulnerable. Our cleaning crew, as I said, we're also outsourced. And so I rarely see our cleaning crew. And so I'm not sure how they were handled and treated. My guess is that very similarly. I do know that we have had conversations in terms of one of the working groups on which I serve of the task force, which is the Safety, Security, and Communications Working Group. And we have talked about what our procedures are regarding cleaning. And like Deidre, you know, we had that similar card. You know, when I finally returned to my office about 2 weeks ago, I'm only on campus about 2 days a week. As an African-American who is also diabetic, we provided, we all went home in March, right, and continued to work from home remotely. But as we began this return, we had an opportunity to put in a request for accommodations. And so I put in a request for accommodation to continue to work from home. I happen to work, as you said, out of the office of the chancellor. I'm in a key leadership role here. And part of, you know, leadership is also presence, right? And so the fact that I'm in my office today broadcasting and, you know, this Zoom here my door is closed, my office door is closed. You know, we wear a mask as soon as we appear on campus. I come directly to my office. My accommodation is that for 2 days a week, I come directly to my office. I keep my door closed. My assistant is not here with me during those days. And we are trying our best, right? I tried to push that point as an African-American, but I also recognize my leadership role. There are other colleagues of mine on campus who are African-American who have different accommodations that have allowed for them to continue to work from home, taking that into consideration, as is the case of just, you know, other colleagues in general based on health-related issues. I want to go back. It's interesting. You mentioned, and I didn't address the fact that Webster University is global, right? And so we have a campus in Ghana, right? And I think we will all recall, as Deidre said, you know, there was this thought that Black folks won't get it, right? And there was this also wish, and you know, we were waiting to accelerate into the heat of the summer because the heat would take care of this virus, right? Well, Ghana is in Africa, lots of Black folks, and a lot of heated days. The virus is there, and the virus is taking lives there as well. And we also had to deal with that on our globally as well, you know, back in early March, how we would deal with those campuses. And we were all, just as we were here, impacted by our local government and guided by that, we were guided by local governments there as well. And our Ghana campus still today, they are remote as well. Because their numbers, you know, it has taken some time and has certainly impacted them differently. You also have to take into consideration a certain level of cultural understandings and cultural thoughts around this virus as well. And you know, the mindset in Ghana, very much like at times here in the United States, and particularly for some of our leaders, you know, is the idea that, you know, we have this under wrap, or, you know, this will just pass by us. And I don't know that folks in Ghana have taken it as seriously. And so we have had to deal with that. And so our campus there is still actually closed. And you know, and so we also are, you know, we have an arts program here, and we have a health sciences program here. And in our early days as well, we took all of those, you know, hide serious masks and all of that our artists use in arts program, and all the PPEs. And we've also made a donation into the community, particularly into some of our hardest hit communities, to make sure that those areas had support. Those were supplies that we no longer needed at that time.
Yes, like you, St. Louis Community College worked to donate some of the masks that we had early on to the healthcare industry workers who were frontline in that. Now, we all are higher education institutions. We serve students. We still had discussions about diversity and inclusion, and particularly equity, when we transitioned to an online structure, because we simply found that when it came to hardware, Wi-Fi availability, many of our students of color and many of our students who come from poorer neighborhoods simply did not have that mobility. It's one thing to have a phone. Pretty much everybody has a phone, and it's easy to communicate or send a text. But when you get to the point where you have to do some serious homework, a phone is not ideal. And so through the leadership of our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Dr. Christine Davis, we were able to use some CARES money to make sure that we were able to provide laptops to individuals who needed them, to provide hotspots for individuals who needed them. So can you talk a little bit about how each of you took into consideration the term equity when it comes to students? And I'll go with you, Vince, to start that discussion off.
Sure. Yes, and yes to everything that you said, right? We, you know, these smartphones are great, but you can't do work on them. You cannot do work on them. And so we too, immediately, we had our, you know, even before we made the decisions to close, we had our chief IT person, and her team really going out. Purchase orders were immediately approved so that we could buy more Chromebooks and all of those things so that we could send not only our students home, but some of our staff as well, right? That they did not have those tech pieces at home that would allow for them to work as well. And so we had a huge investment to make sure that equity piece was accessible for all. We even at this point began to ask staff or faculty to look at their curriculum and to ask them to qualify or to list tech pieces as a requirement for the class. Because as it's listed as a requirement, then it allows for students to access it through financial aid as well. And what we know here at Webster University is about 95% of our students are on some sort of aid, right? And so the fact then that if a camera, some students may have had a laptop, but they didn't have a laptop that had a camera, right? And so if we could then have faculty members list cameras as a part of their requirement for textbooks, right, then that would allow for them to be covered. We also then had immediate emergency funds that we set up as well back in March for students to then put in a request to then receive funding from the university as grants to help them then access those tech needs that they may have had as well. It still is a challenge for us still today. And as I said, the big piece that has helped us is the fact that professors have required tech pieces as a textbook requirement piece. And so it has allowed for students to then carry over financial aid and assistance to cover those costs.
Dr. Denny, and I go back and forth between Dr. Denny and Deidre since I know you, but please address that. How did you think about the term equity as it relates to the students?
So, that was, for me, equity was really part of all the work that was being done on the campus, right? And when it hit and we had students that we know didn't have computer equipment because they were coming to our library and staying all night in the library until it shut down, we were very concerned. And so we called, emailed, sent snail mail to students to say, do you have, especially if they didn't show up in class, where are you? What's going on? What's happening? Sometimes it was, I now have double shifts at work because I'm an essential worker, so I can't do or participate. I'm frozen. You guys are frozen. Can you all still hear me?
We do hear you.
We can hear you fine. Or at least we could hear you.
Okay,
Okay.
there you go.
Yeah.
All right, we're back. I don't understand technology.
And
So
the
basically,
challenge that our students have.
correct.
It's
Yes.
the same challenge that our students have.
Exact same. So one of the things we did was we went to Verizon and we got hubs, Wi-Fi hubs from Verizon, and we made sure our students had access to those. They just checked them out of the library. We also got laptops. You just check that out of the library. We ended up having I forget how many, quite a few that were left over. And I have a friend that's at the K through 12 Anne Arundel Community Public Schools. And she said, I've got about 600 students that have no access. So we allowed them, the public school, to come and get the additional hubs that we had left over, the hotspots, and we gave them to the schools, because there shouldn't be any student that's not able to get connected. But we were real thoughtful around connectivity and making sure that students, faculty, and staff still had connectivity, because, quiet as it's kept, we have faculty and staff that don't have computers at home. And now you're saying that you're going to pay me all the way through June 30th, so I'm not going to lose my job, but you want me to log in and be a part of a conversation or a meeting, and all I've got is a phone, and I've got kids at home and they're using the hotspot, and how do I do this? And so we extended that opportunity to faculty and staff as well, just like we do our food bank, that if you're a faculty or staff member and you are food insecure, you can come to our food bank and get food, no questions asked, no forms to fill out. we had to do the same thing with the technology to ensure that people could still connect. Because, I mean, I've been doing training and development for 30 years, and way back when I was just a baby and, you know, 3 years old, and I was training at General Electric in Louisville, Kentucky, I used to do computer classes. And the gentlemen in the class, because it was always all male, they were in their 50s, and this whole computers business was new and foreign to them. But there was an expectation that in order for them to continue to work, they had to have some technology background. And, you know, so there's a great divide, even in 2020, in the 21st century, with people having the access to computers and technology.
Yes. I saw you wanted to jump in there, Vincent.
I can't recall what it was now. There was something that Deidre said that struck me.
I'm just so eloquent. I just said it and you don't have to repeat it.
Yeah. So true, so true.
I'll tell you, one thing that appears in the chat that I did want to address is how we dealt with our athletes. And like you all, I'm sure all of your spring seasons were canceled. And we are not a part of the Power 5 college football. So none of our decisions going forward have been influenced by the economics of college sports. And in fact, as we started having conversations within the last month about how are we going to do this in the fall, our decision was made by the National Junior College Athletic Association that there will be no fall sports. Did you all have any interactions with regard to sports and athletes?
So I can speak from two perspectives. At the community college, yes, the students, you know, they missed their season. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And now that I'm not at the community college anymore, I'm not quite sure how they're working on their season now. At Transy, where I am now, NCAA has come down and said this is what's going to happen, and we're Division III, and so our sports are pretty much dead in the water, so to speak, with some exceptions. There are something like golf or volleyball that's, you know, outside. They'll still be able to have some sort of season, but it's going to be very truncated. It's probably going to be anywhere between 7 to 9 opportunities, but you got to have an opponent, and each school gets to decide whether or not they want to play, because it's about what's safe for their athletes. So, you know, I think that even this season's going to be a wash for many student athletes. One of the things that Transylvania's done is we've added what we call a Pioneer Plus, where if you are here at the college and you're taking classes and you didn't get to play in your season and your season's canceled, we will pay your tuition at the end of the your matriculation, so that you have an additional year and you can play your sport, or you can do your art, or you can do your craft, or what have you, and you won't be on the hook for that additional tuition. So we've just added a year in order to give student athletes and performing arts an opportunity to continue.
Did you all have any interaction on sports, Vincent?
We too are a Division III school, and you know, at that time, obviously, when we went home, sports, the season was canceled. But as we are now returning, right, that's what we're being faced with as well. But again, many decisions are being made for us, right? The governing bodies of the sports world as well that are making those decisions for us. And so our seasons, our fall seasons have in fact been canceled. However, our teams continue to socially distance and continue to practice as best they can, just for the development of those students and their skills, so that they can continue. But that has required obviously a lot of skill and grace for them around that ability to do so in a way to keep everyone yet safe.
Now I want to transition away from COVID-19, because we were actually dealing with a pandemic within a pandemic.
Yeah.
You know, we saw instances of blatant racism and killings of unarmed Black men, from the incident in New York and Central Park with Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, and where Amy leaned on a concept that many of our institutions have been introduced to in the last 5 years of white privilege. It conjured up memories of Emmett Till, sort of weaponizing police by feigning an assault. And then we saw the images of Ahmaud Arbery being gunned down by vigilantes, Breonna Taylor. We saw in real time as the nation and the world. I mean, I got calls from friends in Tunisia following the video of George Floyd. And the responses of our institutions regarding that, followed by, right after that, Rayshard Brooks, which we'll come back to in Atlanta. And again, as I started off this conversation, even within the last few days involving Jacob Blake. So we were dealing with a pandemic inside of a pandemic. And before we get to how our institutions individually responded, let's take a moment to talk about how we responded individually. And if you will, I'll just share with you, at the time I was sharing that I was feeling so many different emotions at once: frustration, anger, here we go again. Individuals were reaching out to me, providing their sympathy, asking what should they do. And so I was processing that, having conversations with my 2 kids, having conversations with my friends. At the same time, we in our individual roles were asked to help process and lead our institutions as if we were having out-of-body experiences with no connection. How were you all processing that individually before we get on to how our collective institutions responded? Vincent?
How am I still processing it, right? Like, I can't imagine anyone Black not struggling with that, right? While it is, it's nothing new at all to us in our worlds. It's nothing new. The unfortunate piece of it was, you know, I do say this, 2020, we think about 2020. We will, of course, remember 2020 as COVID and these racial, what I'm calling reckoning and hopefully reimagining in this society. We, as Black folks, have known those brutalities committed against us for as long as I can, as history will tell us. But because COVID had us at home, people saw and couldn't deny what was seen and what was captured again on these devices. And I received so much, like you, Keith, so many calls from my white friends and white colleagues of wanting to check in on me and wanting to see how I was doing, and then pivoting to what it was that they could do. Right. And so in that same time and space of trying to like process and just being, to be frank, just pissed off, right? And angry, trying to process that. And Keith, it's really hard for me to really just talk about how I was processing it personally and not think about the professional piece, because they both smacked up so quickly, right? Because I was also, as Chief Diversity Officer at Webster University, a global institution, being asked to also help lead us in our response. At the same time of also having to deal with my own response. And it was exhausting. This has probably been the most exhausting summer time in my career that I've ever had, right? Because it's that personal piece plus that professional piece. And there's this personal piece of like, this is how I feel. I'm angry, I'm mad, but I also have to have this hat and help to lead this institution through this. An institution led by white folks, an institution led by caring white folks, an institution led by liberal white folks, but nonetheless by white folks who can appreciate from afar, who can understand from afar, but not have lived that experience in that moment, right? And so while I want to say some things, I have to also think about filtration and filtering what it is that I want to say and how I want to process this. Because I also recognize my role. And it's a challenge, and it was a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge, but it is a growth opportunity, right? A growth opportunity for me personally, because I was able to actually at some point sit down with my chancellor and say, listen, this is where I am as a Black man in America. And this is where I am as a Black man leading our diversity efforts at this institution. And one of the best conversations I think I've had during this entire time, because it allowed for me to actually be able to show up fully as a Black man who's angry and pissed off in a role as Chief Diversity Officer for this university, right? And for her to understand that, and for us to have a language and dialogue that, as she says, allows for me to be raggedy and we can clean it up a little bit later. It's still work in progress for us.
Because a lot of times they don't look at you and me as them, because more than likely we're walking around shirt and tie, we're pontificating thoughts. I've been pulled over by the police. I've had negative interactions simply because I was in the wrong neighborhood. And so when those things happen, it's not something that I have to imagine happening. I'm recalling instances. And so it's very personal. Deidre, this is not just about being a Black male. I called the name of Breonna Taylor. There are so many other names, Sandra Bland. There are so many other names that do not make this just about a Black male thing. But I know you have 2 children.
That's right.
I ask you how you personally were dealing with that.
Being Black in America, you're in a constant rage, aren't you, baby? That's just the nature of the beast. So yeah, the whole attack on the Black community, especially Black males, is extremely troubling to me, and it's personal. My youngest son is the same age that Ahmaud Arbery will be forever. And my youngest son, he lives in Alabama, and he's married to a white female, and they now have a biracial baby. And my son gets pulled over, and his wife gets questioned. Do you know this man? Are you safe with this man? And we're talking last week, okay? And so I never sleep. As a Black mother in this country, I never get a good night's sleep. My phone is always on, next to my head every night. My sons have separate ringtones, so I know it's them. And if their ringtone comes, I sit straight, bolt up in the bed, and I don't even say, hey, baby, how you doing? I'm like, what happened? What you need? What's going on? Are you okay? I shouldn't have to live like that. No parent should have to live that way. But that's the time and the place that we're in. And so I struggle, much like Vincent, in my professional hat and my personal hat. So one of the things that I did was I went on Facebook. I have a lot of Facebook friends because I've worked at a lot of universities in my career and other places. And people, I try to stay connected to people, my community, if you will. And I put on Facebook that I was in a rage, that I was unhappy, that I was angry, that I was upset, that people who looked like me were just being hunted down. And I needed white people to stand up and do something about it. I didn't need them calling me, asking me how I'm doing, if there's anything they can do. There's nothing that you can do except stop this madness. And I need you to speak up and speak out and stand in the gap and be that transition person, white lady, white man, and make this change, make this different. I need my kids to be safe in this world. And I put that out on Facebook. And I also have access to resources. So I started putting resources out on my Facebook page for my friends, books to read, articles to read, websites to go look at, videos, those kinds of things. And I still put that stuff out there. And, you know, this whole thing with Jacob Blake the other day, my God, what the hell is going on? Why do you have to pump that man full of 7 bullets? I mean, really, in front of his children who will never, in the back, and those kids will never get over this. They will never get over this. So trust with the Black community, trust with the brown community. It's broken and we didn't break it. And so we shouldn't be responsible for having to fix it. But unfortunately, the way the world works, we are by and large responsible for finding the solution to a problem we didn't create.
Now I want to pull back the curtain a little bit and talk about our institution's response. I mean, here at St. Louis Community College, our Director of Marketing Communications, Kedra Tolson, along with our Chancellor, Dr. Jeff Pittman, we have support at the leadership level, and we were able to do what most businesses and most institutions were doing at this time, which was to put out our message to the community and also our message within the community, that those incidents were something that we completely abhor. And we showed our concern in crafting that message. And I think it was a very good message. I saw some very weak messages, and I'm a golfer, and I'm sorry, I have to call out not my good friend, but my good golfer, Tiger Woods, that I thought was a weak message. People can go and look it up. And then I also looked at, I'm an ice cream lover, and I looked at Ben and Jerry. And
That's
they
right.
had perhaps the most powerful statement. And so we crafted a statement that was thoughtful and appropriate. And we were able to collaborate on getting that statement out. I want to pull back the curtains and allow our institutions to know a little bit about how some of those statements were crafted. And I want to go to you, Vince, and tell me a little bit about that, because like you, I was in the midst of processing it. Sometimes I would just wake up and write my unhinged thoughts of how I felt. And then I had to dial it back a little bit.
See, that's the challenge. That literally was the challenge for me. We were engaged, our writing process, like, you know, probably many of our institutions, it's a long process, particularly when you are issuing such a statement and it's in collaboration with several voices. And so the statement from Webster came from our chancellor, our president, and from me, right? But of course, we also are working with our chief communications officer, right? And this happened to be a process of us on a Saturday, right? And I am literally in the throes of being pissed offness at my best and highest, right? But needing to read through drafts, right? And wanting to say one thing, but knowing that that's not going to edit, it's not going to make it, right? But I also don't want to put it out there because I don't want to have to deal with the pushback that might come for me in that moment, because I am in my own person. I'm in my feelings right now. And so it became really hard. I'm gonna be honest with you all. It was a moment of fear for me. It was a moment of fear in that, do I really push and say what I really want to say right now? And if I do that, how will it be received? And then what will be my response to that reception? Right? My guess was that the reception would not be one that was affirmative and saying like, yeah, let's roll with that. Right? And so that again is that struggle that we have in our roles as Black people leading institutions through this work of racial equity and inclusion, right? You see my gay flags hanging up here. I'm gay, right? Now, I may not have that same response because my first salient identity is being Black, right? And that is what I wear on my sleeves every single day. So for me, that process was hard. And it was really hard, to the point in which the draft at one point I felt okay with. And then it got to another point later in the night in which I no longer felt good about it. And I no longer could, in consciousness, like sign off on. And I had to call my chancellor and say, I don't like where this has gone. And we had a conversation about that. And we negotiated our way through to a place in which that communication was one that I could sign off on. But I'm gonna be honest, it still wasn't the communication that I wanted. But I also wasn't in a space in that moment and in that time to be able to say, no, this still is not it, right? And so, but as I said, it was one that I could at least go to bed with as a Black man and know that my Black community and my colleagues would at least be open to what was being said, right? Now, what it did was in our communication, as we negotiated, was that we would say that we would have a follow-up communication. And in that follow-up communication, by that time, I then had the courage to say, we must say Black Lives Matter. That's what I wanted to say the initial time, but I wasn't sure how that would be received, right? And sure enough, that was said, and there was no pushback whatsoever. But in between those two statements, I'd also had that conversation that I referenced earlier where I shared with my chancellor my struggles, right? And so, and wanting to just be raggedy and put it all out there. And she said, that's what I need for you to do. That's what I need for you to do.
Especially at a time when you have leadership on high calling Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization.
Right, right.
And some people believe that.
And people believe that. And for me to then say that and to not know where that would land, because we are a global institution, we have to, all of those, all those, you not only have your Black faculty and staff and students, you have alum, you have donors, you have board members, and who knows where all of that will ultimately land with them and what their pushbacks may be, right? It was so great that the president said, let's actually now put up a banner. We have 2 banners on campus that proclaim Black Lives Matter, right? And when you do something like that, it's not a matter of just showboating or not just about PR, because actually what it does is it causes accountability, and you got to figure out where you have ultimately stand with that, because there is pushback that comes. There is pushback that comes. We have received word from some alum who weren't pleased with it because they view it, as you've just said, right, as a terrorist organization, right? But you know what? We say, this is who we are, this is what we believe, right? But also we've received word from our Black faculty, staff, student, and alum who say, okay, glad to see that you all say that. Now let me tell you about a story, a time in which, right? And so there's an accountability and a so, we have to now hold a mirror up to ourselves as well. And that's great. I'm loving this work, right? Because we have made that statement, and now allows for us to think about who we are and think about the actions. Right now, our world and the roles that we have and our colleagues from, in education or who are doing it in private work, you can't get a phone call right now with someone doing DEI work right now. Right? Because everybody wants to have these conversations with them. Everybody wants to, right? So the times in which I wanted to partner with our HR on campus, right? Because of a variety of reasons, it never worked. Well, my phone is ringing with HR right now, right? All the various schools, all the various departments, my phone is ringing because everybody now wants this partnership, right? And it's not just partnership for the sake of partner. Like these folks, and that's what's happened out of this. People are actually spending time, white folks are talking about this in ways in which white folks have never talked about this before, right? And recognize the need that this work in Black Lives Matter is really not only about our Black students hearing and seeing these messages, it's really ultimately about our white students needing to also understand why Black Lives Matter and understanding the need to have a diverse faculty and staff. They need to see Black professors teaching them, right? They need to have that different perspective now. And schools are coming saying, we know that now to be true.
Yes.
I hate that it took us this long to get there, but I'm, you know, if we're to glean a moment of hope out of this and to make these deaths have some meaning, right? These are those opportunities. And, you know, so I'm gonna run with it right now. I'm running.
Absolutely. Deidre, talk to us a little bit about maybe the statement that you all crafted, but then also lead us into some of the initiatives that you all have been thinking about that support those statements, because it's one thing to have a statement, but a statement alone that sits on a shelf is not going to get the needle moving. It's sort of like that James Baldwin quote that, you know, I hear what you say, but I can't hear you because I see what you do. So
Right.
lead us down that path, if you will.
So yeah, so I can tell you succinctly, at Anne Arundel Community College, there were crickets about a statement. So I wrote a statement, didn't ask for permission, didn't ask anybody if they thought it was a good idea. I wrote it and I sent it out to the entire campus. Shortly thereafter, I heard from people saying, but the president didn't say anything. And I was like, why do you need the president to say something since the chief diversity officer already has spoken? But they needed to hear from the president. I honor and respect that. And so I wrote something, sent it to our communications department. They recrafted, and much like what Vincent has shared, you know, what came out was completely different than what went in. But that's okay. People have to own their truth. And so ended up, as a lot of other institutions, having to put out another message because the college was very reticent to say the words Black Lives Matter. Okay, fine. But at the end of the day, what I wanted to know, and this leads into the part that you want me to talk about, is now what? You wrote these statements, you got it out there, you said your piece. Now what are you going to do to support, resource what you say you want, what your expectations are, what your plans are? What is the plan? You know, hey, Sway, how are we doing this kind of thing? And so at Anne Arundel, we decided that equity had to be about everything that we did. So no matter what it is, what decisions we're making, there's an equity question that has to be answered. How does this impact the unrepresented or underrepresented? How does this look for someone that does not have X, Y, or Z? When we make this decision on who's going to lay off, what other decisions can be made, because who's it going to greater impact? What are we doing here, folks? And so for us, it became, and even at Transy now, it's become important to talk about how systems of inequality affect both the dominant and subordinate groups within these systems. You got to call out systemic racism. You got to call out institutional discrimination. And so we've done those things, and we continue to do those things. Anti-racist training. I know that's the buzzword right now, and training does not change behavior. So anybody that calls and says, hey, can you come and do anti-racist training, and then expect that their campuses are going to be automatically kumbaya, sprinkle some unicorn horn dust on them, and we're going to be anti-racist, you're fooling yourselves and wasting your money, because that's not what it's about. In order to change outcomes, you got to change behaviors. So one of the other things that we've done is we hire for our values. Every organization has values and a value statement. You should be hiring around those. And because those are the people that you want to work there. If you've got a value that says diversity, much like Transy does, then I need to know, what does diversity mean to you, new person? before we even make you a new person on our campus, a new hire. What does it mean to you? How do you put it in your work? What are the outcomes? So those are some of the takeaways and the things that we've had to do. Also, it's important to expose students and the workforce to personal histories and experiences of others. These experiences can complicate and disrupt stereotypes and assumptions. You gotta break up the status quo. You gotta disrupt the norm. The thing about COVID that we've learned, at least that I've learned, is that that change can be forced, right? And when you're forced to change, you have to come up with some outcomes. And sometimes those outcomes are really good outcomes. So now we know that you got to wear a mask, and people complain about wearing a mask. Well, there are things that you can do for that mask to make it more comfortable. It's just like diversity, equity, and inclusion at your institution. There are things that you can do to make people comfortable in the beginning, but you can't tell them they're going to remain comfortable, because in order for there to be change, you got to disrupt the soil. Nothing grows if the soil stays compact and hard. You got to water it, you got to fertilize it, you got to plant the seed, you got to agitate it, and in order for anything to grow.
Absolutely. It cannot be like a car wash where you just drive through and all of a sudden you're cured of everything.
Right.
It's got to be a change of lifestyle for an individual as well as an institution. We got about 10 minutes left, so I want to keep talking. I do want to acknowledge one of the questions because it's really timely for what we were talking about, because throughout particularly the Missouri Community College Association, you don't always have a person of color leading that role. And we've got very good, our brothers and sisters who are not of color, who are doing great work, but sometimes they're conflicted a little bit about whether or not they are actually speaking for people of color because they don't have the lived experience. So if you all could maybe balance out some of those suggestions. You know, I'm thinking about my friend Brittany Pagnett Cunningham's response one time to how can someone white be an ally, and she talked about how you have to move from being an ally to an accomplice, and then being from an accomplice to a co-conspirator. You know, an ally is somebody who says, I support what you're doing. An accomplice says, yeah, you know, I support it and I might go with you. But a co-conspirator is your ride or die. I'm going to go down with you all the way. And so can you all speak to that a little bit, to some of our people who are not of color, how they can lend their voice? Because it's not just about listening. That's what we heard 2 months ago. Your role is to listen, but it's not just to listen. Vince?
Yeah, I would say, for one, I mean, this may have just been a matter of semantics here, but I can't even speak for all Black folks, right? And so I certainly would encourage, and it may just be a matter of semantics, but that thought, white people, even in these roles, will not be speaking for people of color, right? Because I can't even do that as a person of color, as a Black person. I can't speak on behalf of all. However, what I will say, and I love, you know, Brittany's point there. By the way, she's on the cover of British Vogue magazine in September. Sister is doing really well. But, you know, I think about the idea of finding that voice. It's what Deidre said earlier. It's finding that voice and utilizing it. So you've heard, you've listened, you've seen, right? You hear over and over. You have now watched, sadly, over and over that public lynching, right? Now do something. Use your voice. Figure out a way to find your way into that conversation. And so, you know, those of us who are in this role who may not then be of color, right? Like, it is imperative, even more so, that you find yourself in spaces of being uncomfortable, and that you raise the voice and consideration to those who are in leadership. And that you, more than even I, be willing to find yourself uncomfortable and possibly afraid, right? Afraid of losing your job. Afraid of losing your job because what you know to be true, because what you have heard matters so much that you know that you have to say it. And you will be heard, interestingly enough, often differently than any of the three of us right now on this screen right now. right? As you are speaking to your colleagues who look more like you, right? It's interesting, after our first statement went out, last year I provided as a professional development opportunity for our white colleagues on campuses a program called Whiteness, and it's based on a book by the same title. Here locally, the YWCA trains white facilitators to go into all white spaces to talk, thank you so much. Yeah. Shelley Touchlet, that's the book. And our first cohort went through, and after that first statement went out, they're the first ones to write a letter to the chancellor, president, and me saying, okay, that was a good, but what you didn't say was, and what you needed to say was this, right? And every last one of the participants in that signed it, plus then they circulated it and got other folks, white folks from across the campus to sign it too, right? And so finding ways to really show up and to speak in and on behalf of people of color, and to do it in some ways in consultation, obviously, right? Like, you need to be informed. You shouldn't just wake up one morning and have this idea and run with it. You need to go check that idea against people for whom you're advocating on their behalf of, right? I have my MSW, social work. You just don't go and tell a client what they need to do, right? You need to figure out what the client sees their needs to be, and then partner with them in making sure that those needs are then met. And so I would encourage those of our colleagues who are not of color in these roles to really find some partnerships, to be able to listen, and to be able to then share those ideas that you have against, do a kind of a fact check, or do kind of a gauge against your thoughts against what folks say that they actually will need, and how you can best support them in that regard.
Any thought on that subject, Deirdre?
I think he said it all.
Yeah.
I concur.
Well, it's wonderful. One of the other challenges that we have in this space is that it is hard to find time, because we can't just have this conversation. Institutions just can't have one conversation. Diversity, inclusion, equity needs to be a part of each opening meeting. It needs to be woven into the fabric of what we are doing. And so just like right now, we are challenged for time, because I'm going to use this time to sort of close. I'm hoping that this is part one, because this has to be ongoing. I'm hoping next time that we have the participants who are listening actually feed into a larger conversation, because we all need to be working together and having these conversations together. So I hope Kaylin and Missouri Community Colleges Association would be open to that idea. So, I want to take this time to thank both of you all for just allowing us to talk as colleagues, as friends, as individuals who are supporting each other, but to be able to have this conversation, sort of knowing that eyes are looking, and sort of educating and putting that out there. And I also really have to take a big shout out to the Missouri Community Colleges Association for providing the platform. I know these things have to start at the top. I'm fortunate at St. Louis Community College that our Chancellor, Dr. Jeff Pittman, supports these issues. I'm fortunate that our Board of Trustees supports these issues. If anyone has any doubt and wants to see evidence of that, I encourage them to go to our website, where they can see a resolution that the board passed in June denouncing racism and acts against people of color, Native Americans, and individuals of the LGBTQIA+ community. So this conversation has to go on, but unfortunately at this time, I need to close and give it back over to Kaylin. If you have any final thoughts, Kaylin, but to my colleagues, I thank you all so much to be a part of this. Kaylin, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Keith. And I have to say, it's been a pleasure working with all of you. Thank you so much for partnering with us and sharing your time and expertise. It really does mean a lot. And for Keith and I think it was important to have your different aspects, especially coming from the different, community college and then a four-year institution. I think that's really important as well. I think Keith would agree. And so when he came to me about this, that is part of what intrigued me, because we do want some different viewpoints and what's going on different campuses. So I really value you both. Thank you so much. And I do have to say, when I was reading your bios, I felt like a little nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, you guys, all three of you are just so impressive. And that happens to me a lot when we're doing these webinars and we get these fabulous speakers and these people that will partner with us, which we're so grateful for. But as I read these bios, I'm like, I need to go back to school. So I do thank you both very much. And again, thank you to all the attendees for joining us. And you can, I know someone said they had to duck out early. We understand that. Some people have written us saying, I'm going to view it later. We will be sending this recording out to everyone that registered via email. And we do have a follow-up webinar to this, Why is Race So Hard to Talk About, on September 9th with Omid from WGU Labs. I urge everyone to join us for that as well as another very important topic, voter engagement, and especially getting young kids to vote. That is also going to be on September 9th, around 2:30 or 3. We haven't quite nailed down that time because we're dealing with someone who's faculty and they do teach classes. So it will be around the 2:30 time, and the Why is Race So Hard will be at 11:15. We do have another one on September 29th, and that's Strength in Numbers, Insights and Strategies. Oh, sorry, my screen just went big and took my script away. Hold on just a second. I don't want to fumble on the title. In Strength in Numbers, Insights and Strategies on How to Weather the COVID Storm in Community Colleges. Once again, thank you guys very much, presenters, attendees, and hopefully I get to work with the three of you very soon again. And one little selfless plug for MCCA, registration for our virtual convention is now open. We have decided to make the switch to being 100% virtual for safety, the unknown. So please check out our website for information about these webinars and our upcoming convention. And again, you can share today's experience on social using the hashtag MCCA webinar. I want to thank you guys one more time and have a great day.
Thank you all.
And I want to encourage everybody to go out and look at Webster Speaks. You can hear more from Vincent Fluellen at Webster Speaks. Look it up.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for that plug, Keith.
Yep. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.